Hey everyone, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where we slowly unravel the deep histories and striking geographies of every nation on Earth. Tonight, our journey carries us to Cambodia, a land where ancient stone temples rise from tropical forests and winding rivers have quietly shaped civilization for over 1,000 years. From the fertile floodplains of the Mekong to the dense jungles of the Cardamom Mountains, Cambodia's landscape has always been both a giver of life and a silent witness to empire, conflict, and rebirth. In this episode, we'll move gently through Cambodia's geography, history, and cultural soul, from the monumental legacy of Angkor to the rhythms of rural village life, to the endurance of a nation that has faced extraordinary hardship and remarkable renewal. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And if you're enjoying these calm, deep dives, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, get comfortable and let's drift into the long, quiet story of Cambodia. Chapter 1. Ancient Foundations. From Funan to Angkor's Rise. Picture, if you will, the vast wetlands of the Mekong Delta some 6,000 years ago. Here, among the meandering waterways and fertile plains, the first stirrings of human settlement began to take root. Archaeological evidence whispers to us across the millennia, telling tales of Neolithic hunter-gatherers who arrived from the misty reaches of southeastern China, bringing with them the seeds of what would become one of history's greatest empires. By 500 BCE, as iron began to replace bronze in their daily lives, these early Cambodians had already developed something quite extraordinary. Excavations reveal circular earthworks dotting the landscape, silent testimony to organized communities that understood both the art of agriculture and the necessity of defense. These were not simple villages, but the foundations of a complex society that would soon catch the attention of distant Chinese chroniclers. As the 1st century CE dawned, maritime trade routes began to crisscross the vast waters between China and India like threads connecting distant civilizations. The monsoon winds, those reliable seasonal giants that still govern life in this region today, became the highways of ancient commerce, and it was along these watery roads that the first great kingdom of Cambodia would emerge from the delta mists. The Chinese, ever meticulous record keepers, began writing about a kingdom they called Funan, though this was likely their attempt to pronounce the Khmer word Phnom, meaning mountain. Imagine the wonder of those early Chinese envoys as they sailed up the Mekong River in the 3rd century, encountering a civilization that would exceed even their considerable expectations. Funan was no simple trading post, but a sophisticated maritime empire that stretched across much of what we now call southern Vietnam, southern Cambodia, and portions of Thailand. At its heart lay the capital city of Viadapura, probably located near present-day Phumi Banam, where rulers held court in halls adorned with treasures from across the known world. But perhaps nowhere did Funan's cosmopolitan character shine brighter than at Ok Ao, the great port city that archaeologists have revealed to be one of Southeast Asia's most remarkable ancient trading hubs. Here, Roman coins nestled alongside Persian gems, Greek artifacts shared space with Indian jewelry, and Chinese porcelain reflected the light of Hindu temple lamps. It's rather like discovering that your quiet neighborhood corner shop was actually an ancient international bazaar, though admittedly, finding Roman coins in your garden would raise somewhat more interesting questions about your property's history. The genius of Funan lay not merely in its strategic location, but in its remarkable ability to absorb and synthesize influences from across the ancient world. The Funanese didn't simply copy what they saw, they transformed it, creating something uniquely their own. Sanskrit became the language of their courts, not through conquest but through cultural attraction. Hindu concepts of divine kingship blended seamlessly with local ancestor worship, creating a religious synthesis that would define Cambodian spirituality for centuries to come. King Phan Ximanh, who ruled in the 3rd century, exemplified this cosmopolitan vision. Under his reign, Funan reached its zenith, controlling trade routes that stretched from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. Chinese records describe his ships as magnificent vessels, 200 feet long and capable of carrying 700 men, along with vast cargoes of precious goods. These weren't simple fishing boats that had gotten ideas above their station, but purpose-built ocean-going vessels that could weather the fiercest monsoon storms. The economic foundation of this maritime empire was as solid as its diplomatic reach was impressive. Sophisticated irrigation systems transformed the Mekong Delta into a rice-producing powerhouse, generating the agricultural surpluses that funded both trade expeditions and monumental architecture. The Funanese understood what many civilizations learned too late, that lasting power rests not on conquest alone, but on the ability to feed your people and trade with your neighbors. As the 5th century arrived, Funan commanded tribute from territories stretching across modern-day northern Cambodia, southern Laos, southern Thailand, and the northern Malay Peninsula. It was an empire held together not by iron chains, but by the golden threads of commerce and the silver bonds of shared culture. The archaeological record shows us temples built in brick and stone, their walls carved with Hindu deities who watched over rice paddies and trading posts with equal divine attention. Yet empires, like monsoons, follow predictable cycles. By the 6th century, internal strife began to weaken Funan's foundations. Civil wars erupted between rival claimants to the throne, and the very trade routes that had brought prosperity began shifting toward new centers of power. The great port cities that had once bustled with international commerce found their harbors increasingly empty as traders sought more stable and profitable destinations. It was during this period of instability that a vassal state to the north began to flex its muscles. The Chinese called this emerging power Chenla, though like Funan, this was probably their attempt to render a local name into their own script. Chenla had been watching Funan's struggles with the patience of a crocodile observing a wounded water buffalo, and when the moment was right, they struck. The conquest of Funan by Chenla was not a single dramatic battle, but a gradual process of absorption that unfolded over several decades. King Jayavarman, the Chenla ruler who initiated this expansion, was no mere warrior, but a shrewd politician who understood that lasting victory required more than military might. He preserved many of Funan's institutions while gradually extending Chenla's influence throughout the former empire's territories. By the late 6th century, Chenla had effectively absorbed Funan, creating a new political entity that historians call the pre-Angkor period. This was not simply a case of one kingdom swallowing another, but rather a political evolution that would lay the groundwork for the magnificent Khmer Empire that was to come. Chenla represented a fundamental shift in Southeast Asian civilization. Where Funan had been primarily a maritime trading empire, Chenla looked inland toward the rich agricultural lands around the Tonlé Sap and the upper reaches of the Mekong River. This geographical reorientation would prove prophetic, as it pointed toward Angkor, the location where Cambodia's greatest glory would eventually unfold. King Yavarman, perhaps Chenla's greatest ruler, established his capital at Sambor Prey Kuk, which he grandly named Ishanapura after himself. The ruins that remain today show us a civilization that had learned well from Funan's example but was charting its own distinctive course. The temples of Sambor Prey Kuk, with their intricate brick construction and sophisticated hydraulic systems, were clear predecessors to the architectural marvels that would later grace Angkor. Yet Chenla, for all its achievements, was not destined to remain unified. By the 8th century, the kingdom had split into two distinct entities that Chinese chroniclers called Land Chenla and Water Chenla. Land Chenla, controlling the northern territories around present-day Laos and northern Cambodia, maintained its independence and cultural vitality. Water Chenla, however, fell under the influence of the powerful Sailendra dynasty of Java, becoming little more than a vassal state in what historians call the Javanese interregnum. This period of foreign domination might have marked the end of Cambodian independence, were it not for the emergence of a remarkable prince named Jayavarman. The historical record tells us that he had spent time in Java, though whether this refers to the island itself or the broader Javanese sphere of influence remains a matter of scholarly debate. What we know for certain is that when he returned to his homeland around 800 CE, he brought with him not submission but a burning desire for independence. In 802, on the sacred mountain of Phnom Kulen, Jayavarman II performed a ritual that would echo through Cambodian history like the first note of a temple bell. In a ceremony that blended Hindu tradition with local custom, he declared himself Chakravartin, universal ruler, and Divaraja, god king. This wasn't merely a political proclamation but a spiritual revolution that established the divine monarchy as the cornerstone of Cambodian civilization. The consecration at Phnom Kulen was more than ceremonial theatre. It represented the birth of what we now call the Khmer Empire. Jayavarman II had learned important lessons during his time under foreign influence, and he was determined that Cambodia would never again bow to distant masters. His declaration of independence was both a political and spiritual act, establishing the king as the earthly representative of the Hindu gods, while simultaneously asserting Cambodia's freedom from Javanese suzerainty. From Phnom Kulen, Jayavarman II moved his court to Hariharalaya, near present-day Roluos, just southeast of where Angkor would later rise. This location was chosen with characteristic strategic wisdom. It commanded the northern shore of the Tonlé Sap, controlled important trade routes, and possessed the agricultural and hydraulic potential necessary to support a great capital. The early temples at Roluos, though modest compared to later Angkorian masterpieces, show us a civilization that was rapidly developing its architectural vocabulary. The Temple of Phrea Ko, with its elegant brick towers and sophisticated drainage systems, demonstrated that Khmer builders were already thinking on a monumental scale. These weren't simply religious buildings, but statements of political and spiritual authority that announced the presence of a new power in Southeast Asia. Jayavarman II's successor, Indravarman I, continued this architectural momentum while expanding the kingdom's territorial reach. His greatest achievement was the construction of Bakong, a temple mountain that would serve as the prototype for Angkor Wat itself. Standing before Bakong today, one can see the architectural DNA that would later manifest in Cambodia's most famous monument, the stepped pyramidal form, the axial approach, and the sophisticated integration of religious symbolism with hydraulic engineering. But in Jayavarman, I understood that temples alone do not make an empire. He initiated the construction of massive irrigation works, including the Indra Tataka Reservoir, which demonstrated the Khmer mastery of water management that would become their civilization's defining characteristic. These were not simple irrigation ditches, but sophisticated hydraulic systems that could store monsoon rains and distribute water throughout the dry season, ensuring reliable agricultural surpluses that could support both growing populations and ambitious building programs. The reign of Yasovarman I marked the next crucial step in this imperial evolution. In 889, he ascended to the throne with visions that would literally reshape the Cambodian landscape. His most momentous decision was to abandon Hariharalaya and establish a new capital at Yasodharapura, the first city built in what would become the Greater Angkor complex. Yasovarman, I chose his location with the eye of both an engineer and a mystic. The site possessed ideal hydraulic conditions, commanded important trade routes, and offered numerous natural hills that could serve as temple foundations. Most importantly, it lay within easy reach of the Tonlé Sap, that remarkable lake whose seasonal expansions and contractions would provide both fish and fertile silt for generations of Khmer farmers. The construction of Yasodharapura was not merely an act of urban planning, but a cosmic statement. The city was laid out according to Hindu cosmological principles, with the temple of Phnom Bakeng at its center representing Mount Meru, the sacred mountain that Hindu tradition places at the center of the universe. This wasn't simply a case of architects getting carried away with religious symbolism. It was a deliberate assertion that the Khmer king ruled not just an earthly kingdom, but a reflection of the divine order itself. The East Barai, a massive rectangular reservoir measuring over 7 kilometers long and nearly 2 kilometers wide, demonstrated the scale of Yasovarman I's ambitions. This wasn't simply a large pond, but a sophisticated water management system that could store enough water to supply the capital throughout the driest seasons. Modern engineers studying these ancient hydraulic works often express amazement at their sophistication and perhaps a touch of professional envy at their builders' obvious competence. Under Yasovarman I's successors, particularly Rajendravarman II and Jayavarman V, the Angkor region continued to develop its distinctive character. The Temple of Bante Srey, built during Jayavarman V's reign, shows us Khmer artistry reaching new heights of refinement. Carved from pink sandstone with a delicacy that seems to defy the hardness of the material, Bante Srey demonstrates that Khmer craftsmen had achieved a level of technical mastery that would be impressive in any era. As the 11th century dawned, the stage was set for the next great chapter in Cambodian history. The foundations laid by Jayavarman II and his successors had created not just a kingdom, but a civilization capable of achievements that would astound the world. The hydraulic systems were in place, the architectural traditions were established, and the administrative apparatus necessary to organize massive construction projects had been refined through centuries of experience. Religious synthesis had reached a remarkable maturity, with Hindu and Buddhist traditions coexisting in a uniquely Cambodian synthesis that would prove remarkably resilient. The Devaraja cult provided ideological unity, while tolerant attitudes toward diverse religious practices ensured that the empire could accommodate peoples of various cultural backgrounds. Most importantly, the Khmer had solved the fundamental challenge that faces any great civilization: how to generate sufficient agricultural surplus to support both a growing population and ambitious cultural projects. Their mastery of water management had turned the seasonal flood cycles of the Tonlé Sap basin into a reliable foundation for prosperity, creating the economic conditions that would support the golden age to come. As we drift toward sleep tonight, let us hold in our minds the image of those early Khmer kings, standing on the ramparts of their temple mountains as the sun set over the Tonlé Sap. They could not have known that their hydraulic experiments and religious innovations were laying the groundwork for Angkor Wat, but they understood that they were building something that would outlast their own brief lives. The ancient foundations of Cambodia were now firmly in place: the political institutions, the religious traditions, the technological expertise, and the economic systems that would soon give birth to one of history's most magnificent civilizations. The monsoon rains would continue their eternal cycle. The Mekong would continue its patient journey to the sea. And on the northern shores of the Tonlé Sap, the greatest temples the world had ever seen were waiting to be born. Chapter 2: The Golden Age of Angkor. As the 12th century dawned over the Cambodian landscape, the foundations laid by centuries of Khmer innovation were about to support the most magnificent flowering of civilization Southeast Asia had ever witnessed. Tonight, let us journey together through this golden age, when divine ambition and human skill combined to create wonders that still take our breath away nearly 1,000 years later. The stage was set for greatness when a young prince named Jayavarman ascended to power around 1113. But this was no peaceful succession. Jayavarman had seized the throne by assassinating his own great-uncle, comparing the deed to destroying a serpent. It's rather like the ultimate family drama, except the stakes were an entire empire, and the stage was one of history's greatest civilizations. Yet from this violent beginning emerged one of Cambodia's most visionary rulers. Jayavarman II understood that true legitimacy comes not from the sword alone, but from deeds that outlast the lifetime of their creator. And so, around 1122, he embarked upon a project so ambitious that it would consume the next 3 decades and employ an estimated 300,000 workers. This was the construction of Angkor Wat, a temple complex so vast and intricate that it remains the world's largest religious structure to this day. Covering over 400 acres and surrounded by a moat more than 200 meters wide, Angkor Wat was not simply a temple, but a cosmic diagram rendered in sandstone, a physical manifestation of the Hindu universe itself. Unlike his predecessors who had favored Shiva, Jayavarman II dedicated this magnificent creation to Vishnu, the protector deity whose multiple avatars guide humanity through the cycles of existence. The temple's 5 central towers represented the peaks of Mount Meru, the sacred mountain that Hindu cosmology places at the center of all reality, while the surrounding moat symbolized the cosmic oceans at the edge of the world. The logistics of this undertaking were staggering. Sandstone blocks, some weighing several tons, were quarried from the Kulen Hills 18 miles to the north and floated down specially constructed waterways to the building site. The precision of the construction is breathtaking. The temple's orientation is calculated to align perfectly with the spring equinox, ensuring that the sun rises directly behind the central tower twice each year. The temple walls are covered with over 13,000 square feet of bas-relief carvings, depicting scenes from Hindu epics alongside historical events from Suryavarman's own reign. The famous gallery showing the churning of the Sea of Milk features 92 demons and 88 gods using a serpent to churn the cosmic ocean, their eternal struggle captured in stone with remarkable dynamism. More than 1,800 carved apsaras, celestial dancers, grace the walls and pillars of Angkor Wat, each one unique in her pose, headdress, and jewelry. These aren't generic decorative figures, but individual portraits that scholars believe were modeled on actual court dancers of the time. Standing before these graceful stone figures today, one can almost hear the whisper of silk and the gentle chime of golden bangles echoing through the centuries. Suryavarman II's ambitions extended far beyond temple building. During his reign, the Khmer Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from the frontiers of Burma in the west to the Gulf of Thailand in the south, encompassing most of modern Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. This was not simply conquest for its own sake, but the creation of a vast trade network that brought prosperity to every corner of the empire. Yet for all his achievements, Suryavarman II never lived to see his greatest creation completed. He died around 1150, leaving Angkor Wat as his eternal monument. The unfinished bas-reliefs that visitors can still observe today serve as poignant reminders that even the mightiest rulers must surrender their dreams to the passage of time. The decades following Suryavarman's death brought turmoil that would test everything the Khmer had built. In 1177, disaster struck when a Cham fleet sailed up the Mekong River and across the great lake of Tonlé Sap to launch a devastating surprise attack on the Khmer capital. The Chams sacked Yasodharapura, killed the reigning king, and established their own occupation that would last for 4 terrible years. But from this darkest hour emerged the most extraordinary figure in all of Cambodian history. Prince Jayavarman, already in his mid-50s, rallied the scattered Khmer forces and began a campaign of liberation that would culminate in his assumption of power as Jayavarman VII in 1181. This was more than simple military reconquest. It was a spiritual revolution that would transform the very soul of Cambodian civilization. Jayavarman VII was the first Khmer king to embrace Mahayana Buddhism, breaking with centuries of Hindu tradition to adopt a faith centered on compassion and the salvation of all sentient beings. Where his predecessors had ruled as incarnations of Shiva or Vishnu, Jayavarman presented himself as a bodhisattva, an enlightened being who had postponed his own entry into nirvana to remain on earth helping others achieve salvation. This transformation manifested itself in what historians call the most ambitious building program in Southeast Asian history. Jayavarman VII didn't simply construct monuments to his own glory, he created what amounts to history's first documented welfare state. His inscriptions record the construction of 102 hospitals throughout the empire, staffed with doctors and stocked with medicines, all funded by royal donations and temple endowments. 121 rest houses were built along the empire's highways, offering weary travelers food, shelter, and medical care. These weren't simple roadside inns, but sophisticated institutions that included bathing facilities, provisions for horses and oxen, and chapels where travelers could offer prayers for safe journeys. It's rather like an ancient version of a highway service station, except one that catered to both physical and spiritual needs. At the heart of this new vision stood Jayavarman's greatest creation, the city of Angkor Thom and its central temple, the Bayon. Angkor Thom, whose name means Great City, was enclosed by walls measuring 3 kilometers on each side and surrounded by a moat 100 meters wide. This wasn't simply a larger version of earlier capitals, but a completely reimagined urban space designed to accommodate the largest pre-industrial city in the world. Recent archaeological surveys suggest that at its peak in the early 13th century, the Greater Angkor region supported a population of between 700,000 and 900,000 people, making it larger than any European city of the time. This vast metropolis was sustained by the most sophisticated water management system the world had ever seen, a network of canals, reservoirs, and rice paddies that covered over 1,000 square kilometers. The Bayon Temple, standing at the exact center of Angkor Thom, represents the most striking architectural achievement of this Buddhist Renaissance. Where Angkor Wat impresses through classical harmony and mathematical precision, the Bayon overwhelms through sheer Baroque exuberance. Its most distinctive feature, 216 gigantic stone faces gazing serenely in all directions from 54 towers, created a temple where the very architecture seemed to embody the all-seeing compassion of Buddhist enlightenment. These enigmatic faces, probably modelled on Jayavarman VII himself in his guise as the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, represent one of art history's most powerful expressions of spiritual authority. As you walk through the temple today, a dozen or more of these faces are visible at any moment, creating an atmosphere of benevolent omnipresence that is both comforting and slightly unnerving. It's like being watched over by the world's most patient and understanding grandparent, if that grandparent happened to be carved from stone and scattered across multiple architectural levels. The bas-reliefs of the Bayon offer us an extraordinary window into everyday life in the 13th century. Unlike the mythological scenes that dominate Angkor Wat, the Bayon's outer galleries showcase the real world of the Khmer people, soldiers marching to battle, camp followers with their ox carts, hunters pursuing wild boar, women cooking and trading in markets, even naval battles on the Great Lake, rendered with documentary precision. These carvings show us that Khmer society was remarkably egalitarian in its treatment of women, who appear as merchants, dancers, and even military commanders. The Chinese diplomat Zhou Daguan, who visited Angkor in 1296, noted with amazement that most of the empire's commerce was conducted by women, a level of economic independence that wouldn't be matched in many parts of the world for centuries to come. Beyond the Bayon, Jayavarman VII created a constellation of magnificent temples that transformed the Angkor landscape. Ta Prohm, dedicated to his mother, was described in its inscriptions as requiring 80,000 people for its maintenance, including 615 female dancers. Today, this temple offers perhaps the most romantic vision of Angkor, where massive silk cotton trees have grown through and around the ancient stones, creating a poetic dialogue between human creativity and natural power. The hydraulic engineering that supported this golden age represents one of humanity's most remarkable achievements in sustainable urban planning. The Khmer created a vast network of reservoirs, canals, and rice paddies that could capture and store the monsoon rains, distribute water throughout the dry season, and produce the agricultural surpluses necessary to support both the world's largest city and an ambitious program of monument construction. This golden age of Cambodian civilization wasn't built on exploitation, but on a sophisticated understanding of how to create sustainable prosperity. The empire's wealth came from advanced agricultural techniques that produced rice surpluses, from participation in international trade networks that stretched from the Mediterranean to China, and from technologies that maximized the productive potential of the tropical environment. The religious synthesis achieved during this period represents one of history's most successful examples of cultural integration. Hindu deities continued to be worshipped alongside Buddhist bodhisattvas, while local ancestor spirits maintained their honored place in village ritual life. Inscriptions from Jayavarman VII's reign show royal donations being made to Hindu temples, even as the king promoted Buddhist institutions, demonstrating a level of religious tolerance that was remarkable for its time. Yet, even as the empire reached its zenith, the seeds of future challenges were already being planted. The massive construction programs, while magnificent, required enormous investments of labor and resources that may have strained the economic foundations of Khmer prosperity. The hydraulic systems that supported Angkor, for all their sophistication, were vulnerable to the kind of massive environmental disruption that could result from climate change or military attack. The 13th century brought new pressures from the emerging Thai kingdoms to the west. These dynamic new states, populated by migrants from southern China who had been displaced by Mongol expansion, began to challenge Khmer dominance in the western reaches of the empire. The Thai possessed advantages that the Khmer found difficult to match. They were more mobile, less dependent on complex hydraulic infrastructure, and led by ambitious rulers eager to carve out their own domains. By the late 13th century, the empire was showing signs of strain. After Jayavarman VII's death around 1218, his successors found it increasingly difficult to maintain the vast building programs that had defined the Golden Age. The hospital system began to deteriorate, the rest houses fell into disrepair, and the careful maintenance of the hydraulic infrastructure became sporadic and incomplete. Environmental challenges compounded these political difficulties. Archaeological evidence suggests that the late 13th and early 14th centuries brought severe droughts that strained the agricultural systems upon which Angkor's prosperity depended. The great reservoirs that had sustained the city through countless dry seasons began to silt up, their careful balance between water storage and distribution disrupted by deforestation and erosion in the surrounding watersheds. The rise of maritime trade routes that bypassed Angkor altogether posed another significant challenge. As Chinese naval technology improved and new ports developed along the Southeast Asian coast, merchants found it easier and more profitable to sail directly between China and the ports of Java or Sumatra, leaving the great inland empire increasingly isolated from the commercial networks that had sustained its prosperity. Yet even as these challenges mounted, Angkor remained a wonder that impressed visitors from across the known world. Zhou Deguan's account describes a city of magnificent palaces, bustling markets, and sophisticated cultural life that continued to flourish at the end of the 13th century. The final centuries of Angkor's greatness saw a gradual shift southward as the centers of Cambodian power moved closer to maritime trade routes and away from the great inland capital. This wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow transformation, as successive rulers found it increasingly difficult to maintain the complex infrastructure that had made Angkor possible. By the early 15th century, the great tradition of temple inscriptions that had documented Cambodian history for centuries gradually came to an end. The final blow came in 1431, when armies from the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya captured Angkor after a prolonged siege. Yet even this apparent ending was more complex than simple military conquest. Many Cambodian nobles had already migrated south, establishing new centers of power that would become the foundation for future Cambodian kingdoms. Angkor was abandoned not because it was destroyed, but because the world had changed around it. As we prepare to close our eyes tonight, let us hold in our minds the image of Angkor at its golden zenith, a city larger than any European metropolis of its time, sustained by engineering marvels that harmonized human needs with natural rhythms, adorned with temples that translated cosmic visions into earthly stone, and populated by a sophisticated civilization that had achieved a level of cultural synthesis and technological mastery that would not be surpassed in Southeast Asia for centuries to come. The Golden Age of Angkor was more than a remarkable historical episode. It was a demonstration of what human beings can accomplish when visionary leadership, technological innovation, and spiritual aspiration combine in service of a civilization that values both individual achievement and collective welfare. In our next journey, we shall explore how this golden dream gradually gave way to darker realities as Cambodia entered a period of foreign domination and internal struggle that would test the resilience of its people and the endurance of their cultural heritage. Chapter 3: Colonial Shadows and Independence Struggles. As the great temples of Angkor gradually surrendered to the encroaching jungle, Cambodia entered what historians call its Dark Ages, a period of 4 centuries, during which the kingdom became a pawn in the power struggles of its more aggressive neighbors. Tonight, let us follow this resilient nation through its most challenging period, from the abandonment of Angkor to the triumphant moment when a young king reclaimed his country's independence through skillful diplomacy rather than force of arms. The year 1431 marked more than just the fall of a city. It represented the end of an epoch. When Siamese forces captured Angkor after a 7-month siege, they weren't simply conquering territory but forcing Cambodia to confront a harsh new reality. The great hydraulic civilization that had sustained 1 million people for centuries had become economically obsolete, outpaced by maritime trading networks that made inland empires increasingly irrelevant. Prince Ponhea Yat, who had rallied resistance after the Siamese installed a puppet king, made a momentous decision that would define Cambodia's future. Rather than attempting to restore Angkor's faded glory, he led his people southward to the confluence of the Mekong and Tonlé Sap rivers, establishing a new capital at Phnom Penh in 1434. This wasn't retreat, but strategic adaptation, a recognition that Cambodia's survival depended on embracing the maritime economy that was reshaping Southeast Asia. The shift from Angkor to Phnom Penh represented more than a change of address. It marked Cambodia's transformation from an agricultural empire sustained by rice surpluses to a commercial kingdom dependent on international trade. Phnom Penh's location offered access to the sea through the Mekong Delta, connecting Cambodia to the vast trading networks that linked China with the Indian Ocean. Yet this geographical advantage came with a cruel price: vulnerability to the same neighbors who had forced the abandonment of Angkor. The 16th century brought a brief renaissance under King Ang Cham I, who ruled from 1516 to 1566 and proved to be the most capable Cambodian monarch since the fall of Angkor. He established his capital at Long Vec, surrounded it with stone fortifications, and even sponsored the carving of additional bas-reliefs at Angkor Wat, demonstrating that the Great Temple remained central to Cambodian identity despite the court's relocation. For nearly half a century, Ang Chan managed to maintain Cambodian independence through a combination of military strength and diplomatic skill. Long Vec became a cosmopolitan entrepot where Chinese merchants traded alongside Malays, Japanese, Arabs, Spaniards, English, Dutch, and Portuguese. The city's markets overflowed with precious stones, metals, silk, cotton, incense, ivory, lacquer, and the exotic rhinoceros horn that commanded premium prices in Chinese medicine. It's rather like discovering that your sleepy hometown was once a major international airport, complete with all the cultural complexity and economic opportunity that such status entailed. This prosperity, however, rested on foundations more fragile than they appeared. Cambodia found itself caught between two expanding powers, the Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya to the west and the Vietnamese Nguyen lords to the east. Both viewed Cambodia not as an equal partner in regional commerce, but as territory to be controlled or absorbed. The delicate balance that had sustained Cambodian independence since the fall of Angkor was increasingly difficult to maintain. The catastrophe that Cambodian chronicles describe as the event from which the nation never fully recovered came in 1594, when Siamese forces captured Long Vec after a prolonged siege. For the first time since the early centuries of the Khmer Empire, Cambodia came under direct foreign political control, with a Siamese military governor installed in the capital. This wasn't simply conquest, but the beginning of a pattern that would define Cambodian politics for the next 3 centuries. What followed was a grim game of political ping-pong, with Cambodia bouncing between Siamese and Vietnamese spheres of influence as rival kingdoms competed for dominance in mainland Southeast Asia. Weak Cambodian kings sought protection from whichever neighbor seemed less threatening at any given moment, only to find that such protection inevitably came with demands for territory, tribute, and submission to foreign interests. The Vietnamese southward march proved particularly devastating for Cambodia's territorial integrity. In 1620, Vietnamese settlers reached the Mekong Delta, beginning a process of colonization that would eventually deprive Cambodia of its most fertile agricultural lands and access to the sea. When King Che Chet II married the daughter of a Vietnamese lord in 1620, seeking alliance against Siamese pressure, he unknowingly opened the door to decades of Vietnamese immigration and political interference. The 18th century brought Cambodia to the brink of extinction as an independent state. Both Siamese and Vietnamese forces treated Cambodian territory as a battlefield for their mutual rivalry, while successive Cambodian kings found themselves reduced to the status of vassals crowned in Bangkok or dependent on Vietnamese military protection. The kingdom's population was decimated by constant warfare, many of its Buddhist temples destroyed, and its cultural traditions disrupted by foreign occupation. That Cambodia survived this dark period at all was largely due to the preoccupations of its neighbors. While the Siamese were expending their energy fighting the Burmese, the Vietnamese were absorbed by internal strife and their own conflicts with China. Cambodia persisted in the gaps between greater powers, like a small tree growing in the shadow of giants, somehow finding enough light to survive, even when logic suggested it should have withered away. By the early 19th century, Cambodia had reached its lowest ebb. The kingdom was placed under joint Siamese-Vietnamese suzerainty, with rival claimants to the throne backed by competing foreign patrons. When a British agent visited the court, he reported that the Cambodian king was ready to throw himself under the protection of any European nation that might offer salvation from this humiliating predicament. That salvation came from an unexpected direction. French expansion into southern Vietnam during the 1860s created a new power dynamic in mainland Southeast Asia, one that offered Cambodia an opportunity to escape the vice grip of its traditional enemies. King Ang Duong, recognizing that European intervention might be preferable to continued vassalage to his neighbors, had already begun exploring the possibility of French protection when he died in 1860. His successor, King Norodom, inherited both the throne and the diplomatic challenge of navigating between competing foreign interests. When Siamese and Vietnamese pressure intensified, threatening to partition Cambodia between them, Norodom made the fateful decision that would define his country's next 90 years. On August 11th, 1863, he signed a treaty establishing a French protectorate over Cambodia, trading independence for survival. The French protectorate was established not from altruistic motives, but from cold colonial calculation. French officials saw Cambodia as a buffer between their Vietnamese territories and British-influenced Siam, while the country's supposed mineral wealth and the Mekong River's potential as a trade route to southern China added to its strategic value. What they found, however, was a kingdom whose legendary riches had long since been dissipated by centuries of warfare and foreign exploitation. Initially, French control was surprisingly light. Unlike in Vietnam, where colonial administrators imposed direct rule, the French allowed Cambodia's traditional monarchy and Buddhist institutions to continue functioning, recognizing that dramatic changes might provoke resistance they weren't prepared to suppress. King Norodom remained on his throne, provincial governors continued their administrative duties, and village life proceeded much as it had for centuries. Yet beneath this facade of continuity, fundamental changes were taking place. French residents gradually assumed control over finance, foreign affairs, and major policy decisions, while the monarchy was transformed from an absolute institution into an elaborate ceremonial pageant. The king retained his palace, his court rituals, and his religious functions, but real power shifted to French officials who viewed Cambodia as a convenient backwater, requiring minimal investment and generating modest but reliable profits. The French did accomplish some genuinely beneficial projects during their 9 decades of rule. They restored and studied the temples of Angkor, giving Cambodians a clearer understanding of their medieval heritage and kindling pride in their historical achievements. They built roads, established basic healthcare systems, and created the first modern schools, though education remained limited to a tiny elite and was designed more to produce compliant administrators than independent thinkers. Perhaps most importantly, the French prevented Cambodia from being absorbed by its neighbors, ensuring that the kingdom survived into the modern era as a distinct political entity. This was no small achievement without French intervention. Cambodia might well have suffered the same fate as the Cham kingdoms, reduced to ethnic minorities within larger states that cared little for their cultural preservation. Yet, the colonial period also created problems that would haunt Cambodia for decades after independence. French rule discouraged political participation by ordinary Cambodians, leaving the country with virtually no experience of democratic governance when independence arrived. The colonial economy remained focused on rice and rubber exports, with little industrial development or investment in human capital that might have provided a foundation for post-colonial prosperity. The transformation of Cambodia's hereditary monarchy into an elective institution, with kings chosen by French administrators rather than traditional succession laws, undermined the legitimacy of royal authority while creating precedents for foreign interference in Cambodian politics that would persist long after the colonial period ended. World War II shattered the illusion of French invincibility and accelerated the emergence of Cambodian nationalism. When Japanese forces occupied Indochina in 1941, while leaving Vichy French administrators nominally in charge, the contradictions of colonial rule became impossible to ignore. In March 1945, the Japanese encouraged King Sihanouk to declare independence, though Allied victory later that year restored French control. The brief taste of independence had been intoxicating. For 8 months, Cambodians had governed themselves without foreign oversight, and the experience awakened aspirations that would not be easily suppressed. When French forces returned, they found a kingdom where nationalism had taken root among students, Buddhist monks, and urban professionals who no longer accepted colonial rule as inevitable or beneficial. King Norodom Sihanouk, who had been installed by the French in 1941 as a presumably malleable 18-year-old, proved far more politically astute than his patrons had anticipated. Recognizing the changing mood of his people and the broader trend toward decolonization in Asia, he began positioning himself as the leader of Cambodia's independence movement, while carefully avoiding the revolutionary violence that characterized anti-colonial struggles elsewhere in Indochina. The young king's royal crusade for independence combined shrewd political calculation with theatrical flair that captured international attention. In 1953, frustrated by French reluctance to grant meaningful autonomy, Sihanouk embarked on a high-stakes gamble that would either secure Cambodia's freedom or cost him his throne. Declaring that he would not return until the French granted full independence, Sihanouk left Phnom Penh for self-imposed exile, first attempting to establish himself in Bangkok before settling at his villa near the ruins of Angkor. From this symbolically powerful location, surrounded by the monuments of Cambodia's greatest achievement, he issued ultimatums that put France in an impossible position. The French could have replaced Sihanouk with a more compliant monarch, but their deteriorating military situation in Vietnam made Cambodia increasingly important as a stable anchor for their remaining Indochinese possessions. Moreover, Sihanouk's international publicity campaign, including a dramatic appeal published in the New York Times, had begun generating sympathy for Cambodia's cause among Western nations, whose support France needed for its global Cold War position. Sihanouk's strategy proved brilliant. Rather than risk further instability in an already troubled region, the French chose accommodation. In July 1953, they announced their readiness to grant full independence to all 3 Indochinese states. By October, Cambodia had regained control of its police, judiciary, and military forces, marking the end of 90 years of French colonial rule. On November 9, 1953, King Sihanouk returned to Phnom Penh in triumph as his people celebrated Independence Day with joy that had been building for nearly a century. The young monarch, who had been chosen by colonial administrators as a convenient puppet, had outmaneuvered his patrons through a combination of political skill, timing, and an intuitive understanding of how changing global circumstances could be leveraged to achieve national goals. As we settle into sleep tonight, let us remember that Cambodia's journey from the dark ages of foreign domination to the bright dawn of independence was not inevitable. It required centuries of patient endurance, the preservation of cultural identity under the most challenging circumstances, and ultimately the emergence of leadership capable of recognizing and seizing the moment when independence became possible. The colonial period, for all its injustices and limitations, had preserved Cambodia as a distinct nation and provided the foundation for modern statehood. The challenge facing the newly independent kingdom would be whether the institutions and experiences of 90 years of French rule had prepared Cambodia for the complexities of sovereignty in a world still dominated by great power, rivalries. In our next journey, we shall explore how that newly independent nation would navigate the turbulent waters of the modern world, facing challenges that would test every lesson learned during its long struggle for freedom. Chapter 4: Modern Turbulence and Tragedy. The independence celebrations of November 9th, 1953, rang across Cambodia with joy that had been building for nearly a century. Yet, as the cheering crowds dispersed and King Sihanouk settled into the daunting task of governing a newly sovereign nation, dark clouds were already gathering on the horizon. Tonight, we witness how Cambodia's hard-won freedom became a cruel prelude to the darkest chapter in its long history, a tragedy so profound that it would test every lesson learned from 1,000 years of survival. Sihanouk's challenge was formidable. Governing a nation that had spent 90 years under foreign protection in a world suddenly divided by Cold War rivalry. The young king understood that Cambodia's survival depended on maintaining neutrality in a region where such balance was becoming increasingly impossible. His solution was to play the superpowers against each other with the same diplomatic agility that had secured independence from France. This delicate balancing act initially proved remarkably successful. Sihanouk courted both Communist China and the Soviet Union while maintaining diplomatic relations with the United States, accepting aid from all sides while committing to none. He positioned Cambodia as a leader of the non-aligned movement, hosting international conferences in Phnom Penh and presenting his small kingdom as a moral voice for neutrality in an increasingly polarized world. Domestically, Sihanouk created the Sangkum Rista Niyam, or People's Socialist Community, a political organization that dominated Cambodian politics while attempting to blend traditional monarchy with modern governance. Under this system, Cambodia experienced a brief golden age of relative prosperity and cultural flourishing. The economy grew, schools and hospitals were built, and Phnom Penh developed into a graceful city that earned the nickname Pearl of Asia. Yet even as Cambodia basked in its newfound independence, the seeds of future tragedy were already being planted. The neighboring conflict in Vietnam was generating pressures that would soon make Cambodian neutrality impossible to maintain. North Vietnamese forces, seeking sanctuary from American bombing campaigns, began establishing bases along Cambodia's eastern border, turning the kingdom into an unwilling participant in someone else's war. Sihanouk found himself caught in an impossible position. If he moved against the North Vietnamese bases, He would provoke retaliation from communist forces who possessed military capabilities far superior to Cambodia's modest army. If he allowed the sanctuaries to continue, he risked drawing American intervention that could destroy his carefully maintained neutrality. It's rather like trying to remain neutral in a bar fight while people are throwing chairs over your head. Neutrality becomes more of a theoretical concept than a practical possibility. The prince's solution was to publicly protest while privately accommodating. He allowed North Vietnamese forces to use Cambodian territory and even the port of Sihanoukville for supplying their operations in South Vietnam, while simultaneously permitting American diplomatic pressure and occasional border violations. This pragmatic approach kept Cambodia out of direct conflict for several years, but it could not indefinitely shield the kingdom from the expanding war. By 1965, the pressures were becoming unbearable. Frustrated by American support for South Vietnamese cross-border operations and convinced that the United States was plotting against his government, Sihanouk broke diplomatic relations with Washington and turned increasingly toward China and North Vietnam for support. This leftward shift alienated many members of Cambodia's urban elite and military leadership, who viewed the prince's policies as dangerous to the kingdom's long-term interests. Domestic opposition was also growing for economic reasons. Sihanouk's nationalization of foreign trade and banking had disrupted traditional commercial networks, while his ambitious development projects strained government finances. The majority of Cambodians still lived in rural poverty, creating social tensions that would later prove catastrophic. A growing communist insurgency, which Sihanouk contemptuously dubbed the Khmer Rouge, began organizing in the remote provinces where government authority was weakest. The Khmer Rouge leadership represented a particularly dangerous combination of intellectual radicalism and nationalist resentment. Many were French-educated Marxists who had absorbed the most extreme revolutionary ideologies while studying abroad, then returned to Cambodia with visions of transforming their country through violent social engineering. Their leader, Saloth Sa, later known as Pol Pot, was a former teacher whose quiet demeanor masked a fanatical commitment to revolutionary purity that would soon shock the world. The crisis reached its breaking point in March 1970, when Sihanouk left Cambodia for medical treatment in France. In his absence, the National Assembly voted to remove him from power in a coup led by his own Prime Minister, Lon Nol. The ostensible reason was Sihanouk's tolerance of North Vietnamese bases on Cambodian soil, but the deeper cause was the elite's fear that the prince's policies were leading the kingdom toward communist domination. Lon Nol's coup proved to be one of the most catastrophic decisions in Cambodian history. The general was well-meaning but incompetent, possessing neither the political skills necessary to govern effectively nor the military capabilities required to defend the country against its enemies. His declaration that Cambodia would align with the United States and demand the withdrawal of North Vietnamese forces transformed what had been a manageable problem into an existential crisis. From his exile in Beijing, Sihanouk made the fateful decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rather than accepting defeat, he formed an alliance with the Khmer Rouge, calling upon all Cambodians to join their struggle against Lon Nol's government. This call carried enormous weight with rural Cambodians who still revered their former king, providing the communist insurgency with a legitimacy it could never have achieved on its own. The resulting civil war was devastating beyond imagination. American bombing campaigns, initially aimed at North Vietnamese sanctuaries, expanded into a massive aerial assault that dropped more explosives on Cambodia than had been used in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. Between 1969 and 1973, these bombing raids killed an estimated 100,000 Cambodians and displaced hundreds of thousands more, creating precisely the conditions of rural desperation that revolutionary movements exploit. The Khmer Rouge skillfully used this destruction as propaganda, telling peasants that only they could protect Cambodia from foreign invasion and domestic corruption. Their message resonated powerfully with people whose villages had been destroyed and families killed by bombs dropped from aircraft they could not fight. The massive displacement of population also broke traditional social bonds and created the atomized conditions that would later facilitate genocidal policies. Meanwhile, Lon Nol's government grew increasingly corrupt and ineffective. Despite massive American military aid, his forces proved unable to contain the Khmer Rouge advance. The capital became a refuge for hundreds of thousands of displaced civilians, while the countryside fell progressively under communist control. By 1975, the Khmer Republic controlled little more than Phnom Penh and a few provincial capitals, sustained only by American aid and air power. The end came with shocking swiftness. On April 17, 1975, Khmer Rouge forces entered Phnom Penh as Lon Nol's government collapsed. The ragged army of peasant revolutionaries who marched into the capital showed no signs of the triumph typically associated with victory. Instead, they began immediately implementing policies that revealed the true nature of their revolution. Within hours of taking power, the Khmer Rouge ordered the complete evacuation of Phnom Penh. Hospitals were emptied at gunpoint, with patients still attached to intravenous drips forced to walk into the countryside or die. Families were separated, possessions abandoned, and an urban population of 2 million people driven into rural exile under the most brutal conditions imaginable. This wasn't military strategy, but ideological fanaticism, the beginning of an attempt to transform Cambodia into an agrarian utopia through the complete destruction of modern civilization. The new regime, officially called Democratic Kampuchea, was unlike anything the world had previously seen. Pol Pot and his followers weren't simply seeking political control, but the complete transformation of human society itself. They declared 1975 to be year zero, after which all previous history would be erased and a new revolutionary culture would emerge from the ashes of the old world. Money was abolished, religion banned, and private property eliminated. Families were dissolved, with children separated from parents and indoctrinated as instruments of revolutionary surveillance. The entire population was reorganized into agricultural cooperatives, where people worked without wages under conditions that differed from slavery only in their ideological justification. Traditional Cambodian culture, Buddhism, and even the Khmer language were systematically suppressed in favor of revolutionary orthodoxy. The human cost of this utopian experiment was staggering. Scholars estimate that between 1.5 and 2 million people died during the Khmer Rouge's 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days in power, roughly 1/4 of Cambodia's entire population. These deaths resulted from execution, starvation, disease, overwork, and the complete collapse of medical care and social services. The targeting was both systematic and arbitrary. Intellectuals, religious leaders, ethnic minorities, and anyone with connections to the previous regime were marked for elimination. But the killing also claimed countless peasants whose only crime was failing to meet impossible agricultural quotas or expressing insufficient revolutionary enthusiasm. Entire families were destroyed for the suspected disloyalty of a single member, while children were trained to inform on their own parents. The Cham Muslim minority suffered particularly severely, with their mosques destroyed, religious practices banned, and community leaders systematically murdered. The Khmer Rouge's racist ideology viewed ethnic and religious diversity as obstacles to revolutionary purity, leading to what scholars now recognize as clear acts of genocide against specific groups within the Cambodian population. Perhaps most tragically, the agricultural revolution that justified this immense suffering was an utter failure. Despite forcing the entire population to work in rice fields under slave-like conditions, agricultural production actually declined during the Khmer Rouge period. Inexperienced city dwellers were expected to achieve impossible yields through revolutionary enthusiasm rather than practical knowledge, while the elimination of experienced farmers and agricultural experts guaranteed catastrophic results. The regime's isolation from the outside world meant that few people beyond Cambodia's borders understood the scale of the tragedy unfolding. Democratic Kampuchea maintained its United Nations seat and received diplomatic recognition from several countries, while refugees' accounts of mass killings were often dismissed as propaganda by those who preferred not to believe that such atrocities were possible. Border tensions with Vietnam eventually provided the catalyst for the regime's downfall. Pol Pot's paranoid nationalism led to increasingly aggressive attacks against Vietnamese territory, while his internal purges decimated even the Khmer Rouge's own leadership. Vietnam, which had initially supported the Khmer Rouge against American-backed forces, grew tired of unprovoked attacks and began preparing for decisive action. On December 25, 1978, Vietnamese forces launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge, despite their reputation for fanaticism, proved no match for Vietnam's experienced military. Within 2 weeks, Phnom Penh had fallen, and Pol Pot's government fled to the Thai border, where they would continue to receive international recognition and Chinese military support for another decade. As Vietnamese troops entered Cambodian cities and towns, they discovered evidence of atrocities that shocked even hardened soldiers who had endured decades of warfare. The killing fields dotted with mass graves, the torture centers where thousands had been murdered, the empty cities and abandoned villages all testified to a tragedy whose scale defied comprehension. Yet even liberation brought new complications. Vietnam's invasion was motivated as much by strategic calculations as humanitarian concerns, establishing a client government that would serve Vietnamese interests for the next decade. The Cold War dynamics that had helped create the Cambodian tragedy now prevented its resolution, as the United States and China continued supporting the exiled Khmer Rouge to counter Soviet-backed Vietnamese occupation. As we prepare to rest tonight, let us remember that the Cambodian tragedy emerged not from ancient hatreds or inevitable historical forces, but from specific political decisions made by fallible human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control. The nationalism that had once preserved Cambodia through centuries of foreign domination became, when twisted by revolutionary ideology, an instrument of unprecedented destruction. The young king who had skillfully navigated Cambodia to independence lived to see his beloved kingdom transformed into a charnel house with his own political choices contributing to the catastrophe he had tried so desperately to prevent. It remains one of history's cruelest ironies that Cambodia's greatest achievement, independence, after 90 years of foreign rule, became the prelude to its darkest hour. In our next chapter, we shall explore how Cambodia gradually emerged from this abyss of suffering, rebuilding not just its institutions and economy, but its very sense of what it means to be human after such devastating loss. Tonight, we honor the memory of those who perished and the resilience of those who survived, carrying forward the enduring spirit of a civilization that has weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser peoples. Chapter 5: Recovery and Reconstruction. The morning of January 8th, 1979, brought something Cambodia hadn't experienced in decades: genuine hope. As Vietnamese forces entered Phnom Penh and established the People's Republic of Kampuchea, they found a country that existed more in theory than reality. The Khmer Rouge had transformed Cambodia into what one observer called a laboratory of extremism, leaving behind empty cities, destroyed infrastructure, and a traumatized population reduced by a quarter through genocide and starvation. The new Vietnamese-backed government, led by former Khmer Rouge commander Heng Samrin, faced challenges that would have overwhelmed even the most seasoned administrators. Imagine inheriting a country where money had been abolished, where cities were ghost towns, where the educated class had been systematically murdered, and where even basic concepts like private property and family units had been criminalized. It was like being handed the keys to a house that had been not just ransacked, but had its very foundations dynamited. Initially, the international community viewed this intervention with deep skepticism. The People's Republic of Kampuchea, despite ending one of the 20th century's most brutal genocides, found itself diplomatically isolated. The United Nations, influenced by Cold War politics and Chinese pressure, continued to recognize the exiled Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's legitimate government, a decision that must rank among history's most morally questionable diplomatic choices. Only 29 countries recognized the new government, while nearly 80 nations maintained diplomatic ties with the genocidal regime hiding along the Thai border. But for ordinary Cambodians, politics mattered far less than survival. The PRK government, with crucial Vietnamese assistance, began the monumental task of reconstruction. Schools reopened their doors for the first time since 1975. Buddhist temples, which had been systematically destroyed or converted into execution sites, gradually resumed religious services. 7 elderly monks were officially reordained at Wat Unnulum in Phnom Penh in September 1979, beginning the slow restoration of Cambodia's spiritual life. The economic reconstruction proved equally daunting. Private property was restored, allowing families to once again own their homes and small businesses. Markets reopened, and with them came the return of internal trade and commerce. Cities began to repopulate as rural Cambodians, no longer forced to remain in agricultural communes, could move freely for the first time in years. It's difficult to imagine how revolutionary these simple freedoms must have felt to people who had lived under total state control of their daily existence. However, the Vietnamese occupation created its own complexities. An estimated 180,000 Vietnamese troops remained stationed throughout Cambodia until September 1989. Many Cambodians, while grateful for liberation from the Khmer Rouge, viewed this continued military presence as a new form of occupation. Vietnamese settlers, both former residents returning and new immigrants, further complicated ethnic relations, with some estimates suggesting up to 1 million Vietnamese nationals lived in Cambodia during this period. The resistance to Vietnamese control took multiple forms. The Khmer Rouge, far from disappearing, regrouped along the Thai border and continued their insurgency with significant Chinese backing. They were joined by two non-communist resistance movements, the Khmer People's National Liberation Front, led by former Prime Minister Son Sann, and Phun Sin Pech, the royalist movement that formed around Prince Norodom Sihanouk. This unlikely coalition, formally established as the Coalition Government of Democratic Kampuchea in 1982, received substantial support from China, the United States, and ASEAN countries. The irony was profound. The international community, in opposing Soviet-backed Vietnam, found itself supporting a coalition that included the very Khmer Rouge responsible for Cambodia's genocide. It was realpolitik at its most cynical, with humanitarian concerns subordinated to Cold War strategic calculations. Refugee camps along the Thai border became staging areas for guerrilla operations, while international aid, intended for displaced civilians, often found its way to resistance fighters. The geopolitical landscape began shifting as the Cold War drew to a close. The Soviet Union's economic troubles reduced its ability to support Vietnam's expensive occupation of Cambodia. China and the Soviet Union, no longer engaged in their bitter proxy war, became more amenable to negotiated solutions. Vietnam, facing its own economic challenges and international isolation, began signaling its willingness to withdraw from Cambodia under the right circumstances. The breakthrough came through patient diplomacy. Australia's Foreign Minister Gareth Evans emerged as a key architect of what would become known as the Paris Peace Agreements. French diplomat Claude Martin and Indonesia's Ali Alatas also played crucial roles in the complex negotiations. As one American participant remembered, there was always a sense of tragedy overhead, demonstrated by a constant vigil led by monks, chanting and praying for peace. Each of the UN Security Council's permanent members supported different Cambodian factions, requiring delicate diplomatic choreography to bring all parties to agreement. The comprehensive Cambodian peace agreements, signed in Paris on October 23, 1991, marked a historic moment in post-Cold War diplomacy. For the first time since 1970, all Cambodian factions agreed to lay down their arms and participate in a democratic political process. The agreements called for the establishment of the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, or UNTAC, the most ambitious peacekeeping operation in UN history to that point. UNTAC arrived in Cambodia in early 1992 like a small army of hope. The mission involved approximately 15,900 military personnel, 3,400 civilian police, 2,000 civilians, and 450 UN volunteers from 46 countries. Australian Lieutenant General John Sanderson served as force commander, commanding more field troops than any Australian officer since World War II. The mission's scope was breathtaking, supervising a ceasefire, disarming competing armies, repatriating refugees, organizing elections, and essentially running a country's administration. The scale of UNTAC's challenge became apparent immediately. Cambodia in 1992 remained a patchwork of territories controlled by different factions, with millions of landmines scattered across the countryside like deadly seeds. The Khmer Rouge, despite signing the peace agreements, quickly began obstructing the process, refusing to disarm their forces or allow UN personnel into territories they controlled. When UN chief Yasushi Akashi was turned back by a flimsy bamboo pole roadblock, it symbolized the mission's limitations. Despite these obstacles, UNTAC achieved remarkable successes. The mission repatriated approximately 370,000 refugees from camps along the Thai border, one of the largest refugee return operations in UN history. Radio UNTAC became Cambodia's most popular radio station, broadcasting in multiple languages and providing neutral information for the first time in decades. The UN established its own courts, promoted human rights, and began the massive task of mine clearance that continues to this day. The elections of May 23rd to 28th, 1993, represented Cambodia's first genuine democratic exercise in decades. Despite Khmer Rouge threats and intimidation, nearly 90% of registered voters participated, many traveling long distances and facing real dangers to cast their ballots. The queues of Cambodians waiting patiently to vote, many elderly people who had lived through unimaginable horrors, provided one of the most moving images of the post-Cold War era. The election results surprised many observers. Prince Norodom Ranaridd's royalist Fun Sin Pek party won 45.5% of the vote, defeating Hun Sen's Cambodian People's Party, which received 38.2%. However, Hun Sen, who had effectively controlled Cambodia for over a decade, refused to accept defeat. With his control over the military and police, he threatened to lead 7 provinces in secession from Cambodia, creating a constitutional crisis that tested the new democratic order before it had even begun. The resolution came through a characteristically Cambodian compromise that prioritized stability over democratic principles. Rather than allow a single-party government, the constitution was crafted to require a 2/3 majority to form a government, essentially forcing a coalition between Fun Sin Pek and the CPP. Prince Ranaridd became first prime minister, while Hun Sen served as second prime minister, an arrangement that satisfied neither democratic purists nor the clear wishes of the electorate, but prevented civil war. King Norodom Sihanouk, restored to the throne after 23 years, presided over the promulgation of a new constitution on September 24, 1993. The constitution established Cambodia as a liberal, multi-party democracy within a constitutional monarchy, enshrining human rights protections and democratic institutions. It was a document filled with hope and idealism, though time would test its resilience against the realities of Cambodian politics. The dual prime ministership proved inherently unstable. Tensions between Ranaridd and Hun Sen escalated throughout the mid-1990s, complicated by both leaders' efforts to win over remaining Khmer Rouge factions. The situation reached its climax in July 1997, when fighting between forces loyal to each prime minister erupted in Phnom Penh. Hun Sen's better organized forces quickly prevailed, forcing Ranaridd into exile and effectively ending Cambodia's experiment with shared power. The 1997 events marked a turning point in Cambodia's political development. While Hun Sen maintained the appearance of democratic institutions, real power increasingly concentrated in his hands and those of the Cambodian People's Party. The subsequent 1998 elections, while giving Hun Sen a democratic mandate, were marred by intimidation and irregularities that set a pattern for future electoral contests. Under Hun Sen's leadership, Cambodia achieved remarkable economic growth and development. The country that had been reduced to subsistence agriculture during the Khmer Rouge era gradually developed a more diversified economy. The garment industry became a major employer, providing jobs for hundreds of thousands of Cambodians, mostly women. Tourism to Angkor Wat and other historical sites brought millions of visitors and substantial foreign currency. Infrastructure improvements connected previously isolated regions to national and international markets. Cambodia joined the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in 1999, symbolizing its integration into the regional community after decades of isolation and conflict. The country established diplomatic relations with former enemies and developed particularly close ties with China, which became its largest source of investment and aid. By the early 21st century, Cambodia was achieving annual economic growth rates that placed it among the world's fastest-growing economies. However, this prosperity came with significant costs. Civil society and opposition political parties faced increasing restrictions, particularly after Hun Sen's party won overwhelming majorities in subsequent elections. Land grabbing affected hundreds of thousands of rural Cambodians, as valuable properties were transferred to politically connected developers. Environmental destruction, particularly deforestation, accelerated as natural resources were exploited for short-term economic gain. The gradual decline of democratic institutions culminated in the 2018 elections, when Cambodia's main opposition party was dissolved by the courts, leaving Hun Sen's CPP to win every seat in the National Assembly. By this point, Cambodia had evolved from the competitive democracy envisioned in the 1993 constitution into what observers termed a competitive authoritarian system, maintaining democratic forms while concentrating real power in increasingly few hands. In 2023, after 38 years as Prime Minister, Hun Sen announced his retirement in favor of his eldest son, Hun Manet. The transition, completed in August 2023, marked the first peaceful transfer of power in Cambodia's modern history, though critics noted it represented dynastic succession rather than democratic change. Hun Sen remained as Senate President and party leader, ensuring continuity in the country's political direction. Today's Cambodia presents profound contrasts. Phnom Penh sparkles with new skyscrapers and shopping malls, while rural areas remain among the poorest in Southeast Asia. Ancient temples receive millions of tourists annually, while freedom of expression has contracted dramatically. The country that emerged from genocide and foreign occupation has achieved stability and economic growth, but at the cost of the democratic aspirations that animated the early 1990s. As Cambodia approaches its fifth decade since liberation from the Khmer Rouge, the questions facing the nation remain complex. How to balance stability with freedom, development with environmental protection, growth with equity. These challenges echo those faced by many developing nations in an interconnected world. The Cambodia of today, for all its imperfections, represents a remarkable journey from the ashes of one of history's darkest chapters. Perhaps most remarkably, Cambodia has achieved something that seemed impossible in 1979: genuine peace. After centuries of conflict, foreign intervention, and internal strife, the country has maintained stability for over 2 decades. Children grow up never knowing war, families can travel freely throughout their country, and the ancient temples of Angkor welcome visitors from around the world. These achievements, while not addressing all of Cambodia's challenges, represent foundations upon which future generations might build a more just and prosperous society. The story of Cambodia's recovery reminds us that healing from trauma, whether personal or national, requires both time and hope. As the kingdom continues its long journey toward a brighter future, it carries with it the hard-won wisdom that peace, however imperfect, remains preferable to even the most ideologically pure conflict. In this ancient land, where the Mekong flows toward the sea, the future remains unwritten, full of possibility for those who dare to dream of better days. Chapter 6: Geography and Natural Wonders. Imagine, if you will, a land shaped like a gentle bowl, cradled between ancient mountains and kissed by tropical seas. This is Cambodia, a country where geography has been both destiny and blessing, where the rhythm of rivers and the breath of monsoons have created one of Earth's most remarkable ecological theatres. As our journey through this kingdom's story draws to a close, let us explore the natural stage upon which all of Cambodia's human drama has unfolded. Cambodia sits at the heart of Southeast Asia like a precious jewel, covering 181,035 square kilometers, roughly the size of Missouri, if you prefer American comparisons. The country nestles entirely within the tropical zone, just far enough north of the equator to enjoy distinct seasons, yet close enough to bask in perpetual warmth. It's a land where the concepts of winter coats and heating bills remain as foreign as snow itself. The country's most defining characteristic is its bowl-like topography, with the vast central plains forming the bottom and mountain ranges rising like protective walls on three sides. Picture a natural amphitheater designed by geological forces over millions of years, where the performance has been the rise and fall of civilizations, the ebb and flow of waters, and the endless cycle of life itself. Dominating this central depression is the Mekong River, Cambodia's liquid lifeline that flows 486 kilometers through the heart of the kingdom. The Mekong enters Cambodia at Stung Treng province after tumbling through the rapids and cataracts of Laos, but once it reaches Cambodian soil, it transforms into a placid, navigable waterway that widens majestically as it approaches the sea. This transformation mirrors Cambodia itself, turbulent in its upper reaches, peaceful in its central flow. At Phnom Penh, the capital strategically positioned where three rivers converge, the Mekong meets its greatest treasure, the Tonlé Sap River. This 147-kilometer waterway connects the Mekong to what locals call Boeng Tonlé Sap, the Great Lake. But to call this body of water simply a lake would be like calling the Grand Canyon merely a ditch. The Tonlé Sap represents one of nature's most extraordinary phenomena, a lake that breathes. During Cambodia's dry season, from November to May, the Tonlé Sap Lake covers approximately 2,700 square kilometers, roughly the size of Rhode Island. But as the southwest monsoons arrive in May and June, something magical happens. The swollen Mekong River, unable to contain its monsoon-fed waters, forces the Tonlé Sap River to reverse its flow. Imagine a river that changes its mind about which direction to flow, and you begin to understand this hydrological miracle. As waters flow backward up the Tonlé Sap River, the lake swells to 4 times its dry season size, reaching up to 13,000 square kilometers in exceptional years. Its depth increases from a mere meter to as much as 9 meters, creating an inland sea that can accommodate vessels with 3-meter drafts. This annual transformation has earned the Tonlé Sap the nickname the lake that breathes, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the seasons, like the lungs of the land itself. This seasonal flooding creates one of the world's most productive freshwater ecosystems. The Tonlé Sap supports approximately 300 fish species, from the giant Mekong catfish that can weigh as much as a small car, to the smaller but economically crucial blackfish that form the backbone of Cambodian protein consumption. During flood season, fish breed and spawn in the expanded waters, while the annual retreat leaves behind fertile deposits that support both agriculture and an explosion of aquatic life. The lake's importance to Cambodia cannot be overstated. It provides over half of all protein consumed by Cambodians, supports 3 million people directly, and serves as a natural flood control system that protects the entire lower Mekong Delta. UNESCO designated the Tonlé Sap a biosphere reserve in 1997, recognizing it as one of the world's most important freshwater ecosystems, a watery equivalent of the Amazon rainforest. Surrounding this central aquatic stage are Cambodia's mountain ranges, each with its own character and ecological significance. To the southwest rise the magnificent Cardamom Mountains, reaching heights of over 1,600 meters and representing one of Southeast Asia's last great wilderness areas. These mountains intercept moisture-laden monsoon winds, creating some of the highest rainfall in the region, up to 5,000 millimeters annually in places like the aptly named Emerald Valley. The Cardamom Mountains harbor secrets that scientists are only beginning to uncover. Recent biological surveys have revealed over 500 animal species, including 23 classified as vulnerable or endangered on the IUCN Red List. This rugged landscape shelters Asian elephants, Indochinese tigers, clouded leopards, sun bears, and the recently rediscovered Siamese crocodile, a species once thought extinct in the wild. In the forest's shadow caves, researchers have discovered frogs with green blood and turquoise bones, colored by a pigment called biliverdin that makes them unpalatable to predators. The mountain's basalt soil, enriched by ancient volcanic activity, contains precious gems, rubies, sapphires, and zircons that have been mined for centuries. But the mountain's greatest treasure may be their role as a carbon sink and watershed protector, with 43 forest watersheds providing water to nearly 7 million people across the region. To the southeast stretch the Elephant Mountains, an extension of the Cardamom Range that reaches heights between 500 and 1,000 meters. These hills roll down toward the coast like sleeping giants, creating the narrow coastal plain that faces the Gulf of Thailand. Near the sea, Mount Bokor rises to 1,081 meters, offering spectacular views across the coastal lowlands and out to the sparkling waters of the Gulf. In the north, the Dangrek Mountains form a natural border with Thailand, their sandstone escarpments rising an average of 500 meters above the surrounding plains. These east-west trending highlands extend for approximately 320 kilometers, creating a physical and cultural barrier that has influenced regional politics for centuries. During Cambodia's recent conflicts, these mountains provided refuge and hideouts, their caves and forests offering sanctuary to those fleeing the turmoil below. Cambodia's coastline stretches for 400, 35 kilometers along the northeastern shore of the Gulf of Thailand, though various surveys have reported lengths ranging from 435 to 557 kilometers, a testament to the complexity of measuring a coast dotted with bays, estuaries, and over 60 islands. This tropical shoreline presents a stunning variety of landscapes: pristine sandy beaches, rocky headlands, sheltered bays, and some of the most biologically diverse mangrove forests on Earth. The mangrove ecosystems represent one of Cambodia's most precious but threatened natural treasures. These brackish wetlands, where land meets sea, support 37 species of true mangroves, remarkable trees that have adapted to survive in saltwater conditions that would kill most vegetation. With their distinctive prop roots creating cathedral-like spaces above the waterline, mangrove forests provide nurseries for fish, crabs, shrimp, and mollusks, while serving as nesting and feeding grounds for hundreds of bird species. Unfortunately, Cambodia's mangrove forests tell a story of human pressure and environmental loss. Between 1989 and 2017, 42% of the country's mangroves disappeared, approximately 1,400 hectares lost each year. The primary culprits include salt farming, shrimp aquaculture, and charcoal production, activities that have transformed vibrant ecosystems into economic zones. In Sihanoukville alone, 52% of mangroves vanished during this period, cleared for coastal development and tourism infrastructure. The climate that shapes all of Cambodia's natural systems follows the ancient rhythm of the monsoons, a Sanskrit word meaning season. Cambodia experiences two distinct seasons that divide the year as clearly as day and night. The dry season, lasting from November to April, brings clear skies, cool mornings, and the gradual retreat of waters across the landscape. Temperatures remain pleasant, making this the ideal time for both agriculture and tourism. But it's during the wet season, from May to October, that Cambodia truly comes alive. The southwest monsoons arrive like a benediction, bringing approximately 80% of the year's rainfall. These aren't the gentle spring showers of temperate climates, but dramatic tropical downpours that can drop inches of rain in hours. The landscape transforms from brown and dusty to emerald green virtually overnight, as if someone has turned on a cosmic irrigation system. This monsoon pattern has shaped not just Cambodia's ecology, but its entire culture. Rice cultivation, the foundation of Khmer civilization, depends entirely on these seasonal rains. The flooding of the Tonlé Sap, the breeding cycles of fish, the agricultural calendar, even religious festivals, all follow the rhythm established by these ancient wind patterns that have blown across Southeast Asia for millions of years. Cambodia's biodiversity reflects its position at the intersection of several biogeographical zones. The country hosts tropical rainforests in the mountains, deciduous woodlands in the drier areas, vast wetlands in the central depression, and coastal ecosystems along the shore. This variety of habitats supports an extraordinary array of life forms, from the tiny insects that pollinate rainforest flowers to the massive Mekong giant catfish that can grow to 3 meters in length. The nation's forests, which once covered over 70% of the country, have declined dramatically in recent decades due to logging, agricultural expansion, and development pressure. However, significant protected areas remain, including the Southern Cardamom National Park, over 400,000 hectares of intact rainforest that represents one of the largest conservation areas in Southeast Asia. These remaining forests harbour species found nowhere else on Earth. The Cardamom Mountains alone have revealed dozens of new species in recent years, including the Samkos bushfrog with its distinctive green blood, various orchid species adapted to specific microclimates, and possibly the largest remaining population of Asian elephants in Indochina. Conservation efforts increasingly recognize that protecting these ecosystems isn't just about preserving individual species, but maintaining the complex web of relationships that sustains entire ecological communities. Modern Cambodia faces significant environmental challenges that threaten this natural heritage. Climate change is altering rainfall patterns, potentially disrupting the delicate balance of the Tonlé Sap system. Upstream dam construction on the Mekong River threatens to reduce the seasonal flooding that has sustained the region's ecosystems for millennia. Deforestation rates remain among the highest in the world, while coastal development puts increasing pressure on marine ecosystems. Yet there are also signs of hope. Community-based conservation programs in places like the Cardamom Mountains demonstrate that local people can be effective guardians of natural resources when they have incentives to protect rather than exploit them. Ecotourism provides alternative livelihoods that depend on maintaining healthy ecosystems rather than destroying them. International conservation organizations work with the Cambodian government to establish and manage protected areas that balance human needs with environmental protection. The geography that sustained the Khmer Empire at Angkor, abundant water, fertile soil, and strategic location, continues to shape modern Cambodia's development. The Mekong River connects the country to a vast regional economy spanning 6 nations. The coastal location provides access to global markets through the deep-water port at Sihanoukville. The Central Plains remain the rice bowl that feeds the nation and exports surplus to the world. Understanding Cambodia's geography helps explain not just where things are, but why history unfolded as it did. The protective mountains that sheltered the Khmer Rouge also preserve the country's biodiversity. The floods that complicate modern development have sustained agriculture for over 1,000 years. The remoteness that once isolated Cambodia from the world now represents precious wilderness in an increasingly crowded region. As Cambodia moves forward in the 21st century, its greatest challenge may be balancing development with conservation, progress with preservation. The same geographic features that made the ancient Khmer Empire possible, abundant water, fertile land, rich biodiversity, remain the foundation of the country's future prosperity. But only if they are managed wisely, protected carefully, and respected as the irreplaceable natural heritage they represent. In the end, Cambodia's geography tells a story of abundance and vulnerability, of natural wealth and human responsibility. From the snow-fed peaks where the Mekong begins its journey to China, to the delta where it meets the sea in Vietnam, from the cloud-shrouded peaks of the Cardamom Mountains to the coral reefs of the Gulf of Thailand, Cambodia sits at the heart of one of Earth's most dynamic and diverse regions. As night falls across this ancient land, as the sounds of the forest merge with the gentle lapping of waves against mangrove roots, as the stars appear above the vast Tonlé Sap, and the lights of fishing boats begin to twinkle like earthbound constellations, we can perhaps sense what the builders of Angkor felt when they looked out over this same landscape centuries ago: wonder at the beauty of creation, gratitude for nature's abundance, and responsibility for protecting this precious inheritance for generations yet to come. The geography of Cambodia is more than mountains and rivers, forests and lakes. It is the foundation upon which all of human history in this region has been built, the source from which all stories flow, and perhaps most importantly, the legacy that will determine whether future generations of Cambodians will inherit the same natural wealth that has sustained their ancestors for over a millennium.